Picture this. You are standing in the great hall of Ramesses, the gleaming new capital of Egypt, in the year 1254 BC. The air is thick with incense and the weight of ceremony. Before you, on twin thrones of gold and lapis lazuli, sit a man and woman whose resemblance is unmistakable. The same aquiline nose, the same determined jawline, the same royal blood flowing through their veins. The woman is young, perhaps 25 years old, with the graceful bearing of Egyptian nobility. Her father, the man beside her, is in his 50s, his face weathered by decades of absolute power. Around her neck hangs the sacred Uraeus serpent, symbol of queenship. In her hands, she holds the ceremonial sistrum that marks her as great royal wife, the highest position a woman can hold in all of Egypt. Her name is Bintanath, and this is her wedding day. The groom, Ramesses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, beloved of Ra, king of kings, and her father. You watch in stunned silence as the priests intone the ancient blessings, as the royal couple exchange vows that will bind them not just as ruler and subject, not just as father and daughter, but as husband and wife. The very foundations of nature seem to tremble at this union that defies every human instinct, every moral boundary you thought sacred. But this is not the end of the story. This is only the beginning. For Ramesses II, in his insatiable hunger for divine legitimacy and eternal rule, will do this again. In just a few years, another young woman will sit beside him on that throne. Another daughter will become his bride. Her name will be Meritamen, and she too will bear the terrible honor of being both daughter and wife to the most powerful man on earth. This is the story of the Pharaoh who married his own daughter twice. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the horror of what Ramesses II inflicted upon his daughters, we must first understand the twisted logic that made such acts seem not only acceptable, but necessary. In ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh was not merely a king, he was a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, son of Ra himself. Every action he took, every decision he made, every marriage he contracted was seen through the lens of divine will. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order and balance, governed every aspect of Egyptian life. To the ancient Egyptians, the Pharaoh's duty was to maintain this balance, to keep chaos at bay, to ensure that the Nile would flood, that the sun would rise, that Egypt would remain the blessed land of the gods. And what could be more orderly, more perfectly balanced than keeping the divine bloodline absolutely pure? This was the poisonous logic that infected the royal court. The bloodline of the Pharaoh was considered so sacred, so imbued with divine essence, that it could not be contaminated by union with mere mortals. Only another member of the royal family possessed blood pure enough to produce worthy heirs. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and fathers, when necessity demanded it, married daughters. The gods themselves provided the template for this abomination. Osiris, lord of the underworld, had married his sister Isis. Their union was celebrated, mythologized, held up as the perfect example of divine love. If the gods could marry their siblings, the reasoning went, then surely the Pharaoh, himself a god, could do the same. But what the priests and courtiers who perpetuated this system refused to acknowledge was the human cost. Behind every ceremonial marriage, every divine union blessed by the gods, was a real person, usually a young woman, whose life was being sacrificed on the altar of royal succession. Ramesses II ascended to the throne of Egypt in 1279 BC, when he was likely in his early 20s. From the beginning, he showed himself to be a man of enormous ambition and equally enormous ego. He would rule for 66 years, longer than almost any pharaoh in history, and during that time he would reshape Egypt in his own image. The young pharaoh inherited a kingdom at the height of its power. Egypt controlled vast territories from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north. Gold flowed from African mines, tribute poured in from vassal states, and the great temples buzzed with activity as priests offered daily sacrifices to maintain cosmic order. Ramesses was determined to surpass all who came before him. He launched massive building projects, commissioning temples, statues, and monuments on a scale that dwarfed even the Great Pyramids. Abu Simbel, with its 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh carved directly into the living rock, stands as perhaps the ultimate expression of his megalomania. Ramesses, his new capital city, was designed to showcase Egyptian power and wealth to foreign dignitaries and subject peoples alike. But for all his earthly accomplishments, Ramesses understood that his ultimate legacy would depend on the continuation of his bloodline. A pharaoh without legitimate heirs was a pharaoh who had failed in his most basic duty, ensuring the eternal stability of Egypt. His first great royal wife was Nefertari, a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence who became his partner in both rule and affection. Contemporary inscriptions describe her as the one for whom the sun shines, and Ramesses lavished upon her temples, tombs, and monuments that rivaled his own. Together, they had at least 6 children, including Meritamen, who would later become one of her father's wives. His second principal wife was Isetnofret, whose relationship with Ramesses appears to have been more politically motivated. She bore him several children, including Bintanad, who would become the first daughter he married, and Meneptah, who would eventually succeed him as pharaoh. For the first decades of his reign, Ramesses seemed content with this arrangement. But as the years passed and age began to claim his queens, the pharaoh found himself facing a succession crisis that would drive him to actions that horrify us even today. To understand the true horror of what happened next, we must pause to consider the psychological reality of royal marriage in ancient Egypt. For the pharaoh's daughters, there was no choice, no agency, no possibility of refusal. From the moment of their birth, these young women were raised to understand that their bodies, their lives, their very identities existed solely to serve the needs of the dynasty. Princess Bintanad, born around 1290 BC, grew up in the shadow of her father's greatness. Her childhood would have been spent in the women's quarters of the palace, receiving the education befitting a royal daughter, learning to read and write hieroglyphs, studying the religious texts, training in music and dance for ceremonial occasions. She would have known from an early age that her marriage would be arranged for political purposes. But could she have imagined that her groom would be her own father? Similarly, Princess Meritamen, daughter of Nefertari, would have been raised with the knowledge that she was royal property, her value measured entirely by her ability to produce legitimate heirs and strengthen alliances. Both young women would have witnessed the elaborate ceremonies surrounding their parents' marriages, perhaps never suspecting that they themselves would one day participate in such rituals as brides to their own father. The trauma inflicted by this system cannot be overstated. Modern psychology recognizes the devastating impact of incestuous relationships, particularly those involving such extreme power imbalances. These young women had no advocates, no protectors, no possibility of escape. They were trapped within a system that viewed them as breeding stock for the continuation of divine rule. Yet the records show that both Bintaneth and Meritamen not only survived these marriages, but held positions of significant power within the royal court. This resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances speaks to the strength of the human spirit even when subjected to the most dehumanizing treatment. What the ancient Egyptians could not know, what no human being could know before the development of modern genetics, was the devastating biological cost of their obsession with bloodline purity. Inbreeding, particularly the close inbreeding practiced by Egyptian royalty, leads to what geneticists call inbreeding depression, the increased likelihood of offspring inheriting harmful recessive genes. When closely related individuals reproduce, their children have a much higher chance of receiving 2 copies of the same defective gene, one from each parent. This can result in a wide range of genetic disorders, from physical deformities to mental impairment to increased susceptibility to disease. The archaeological evidence of royal inbreeding's effects is sobering. King Tutankhamun, whose parents were likely siblings, suffered from numerous health problems, including a cleft palate, clubfoot, and spinal deformities. His 2 daughters with his half-sister wife Ankhesenamun were both stillborn, their tiny mummies showing signs of severe genetic abnormalities. Other royal mummies from the New Kingdom period show similar patterns of genetic damage. Skeletal remains reveal evidence of diseases and deformities that would have caused tremendous suffering during life. The very practice that was supposed to preserve the divine nature of the royal bloodline was, in fact, steadily degrading it. Yet for all this suffering, for all this genetic devastation, the pharaohs continued to marry their relatives. Their religious and political imperative was simply too strong to be overcome by mere human cost. By approximately 1254 BC, the 25th year of his reign, Ramesses II found himself in an unprecedented situation. His beloved Nefertari had died, possibly during childbirth or from complications related to repeated pregnancies. Isetnofret, his second queen, had also passed away, leaving the pharaoh without a great royal wife to fulfill the ceremonial and religious duties required of Egypt's queen. In the rigid hierarchy of Egyptian royal succession, only women of the purest royal blood could serve as great royal wife. Foreign princesses might be married for diplomatic purposes, but they could never achieve the highest rank. The pharaoh's sisters, if he had any, would be the ideal choice, but Ramesses II had no living sisters available for marriage. This left only one option: his daughters. Bintanath, now in her mid-20s, had grown into a woman of considerable beauty and intelligence. Court records describe her as learned in the religious texts, skilled in the diplomatic protocols necessary for dealing with foreign dignitaries, and possessed of the bearing and presence befitting her royal status. She had been raised from birth to understand her duty to the dynasty, but could she have prepared herself for what was coming? The marriage ceremony itself would have been a spectacle of magnificent horror. The great hall of Ramesses would have been filled with the highest officials of the kingdom, foreign ambassadors, and representatives from every nome in Egypt. The ceremony would have followed the ancient protocols established by the gods themselves, with priests reading from sacred texts that sanctified the union. But imagine, for a moment, what Bintanath herself might have experienced. Standing before the assembled court in her finest regalia, wearing the vulture crown that symbolized her new status as queen, she would have had to speak the words that bound her to her father, not just as the daughter, but as wife. She would have had to accept his touch, his kiss, his claim to her body, all while surrounded by courtiers who celebrated this abomination as a divine blessing. The psychological torture of this moment is almost unimaginable. Yet Bintanath endured it. More than endured it, she thrived in her new role, taking on the diplomatic and ceremonial duties of queenship with apparent skill and dedication. Was this resilience, adaptation, or simply the complete internalization of a system that had normalized the unthinkable? The historical record shows that Bintanath bore her father at least one child, though the details of this offspring's fate remain unclear. The very existence of this child stands as testament to the reality of the marriage. This was no mere ceremonial arrangement, but a full conjugal union with all the physical intimacy that implies. While we cannot ignore the deeply personal trauma inflicted upon Ramesses II's daughters, we must also understand the cold political calculations that drove these marriages. For the pharaoh, securing the succession was not a matter of personal preference but of national survival. A disputed succession could plunge Egypt into civil war, inviting invasion from foreign enemies and the collapse of the entire kingdom. By marrying his daughters, Ramesses accomplished several political objectives. First, he ensured that any children born of these unions would have unquestionably legitimate claims to the throne. Second, he prevented his daughters from marrying foreign princes or Egyptian nobles who might use their wives' royal blood to challenge his rule. Third, he demonstrated to his subjects and to foreign powers that the divine nature of his bloodline was so powerful that it transcended normal human laws and customs. The pharaoh's courtiers and priests would have supported these marriages enthusiastically, not only because they served Egyptian interests, but because opposing them would have been tantamount to questioning the divine will. In a society where the pharaoh was considered a god, his decisions were by definition moral and correct, no matter how they might appear to lesser mortals. This political dimension makes the crime no less heinous, but it helps explain how an entire civilization could not only tolerate but celebrate practices that revolt us today. The system that enabled these marriages was not the product of individual depravity, but of a social structure that had elevated political necessity above human dignity. If the marriage to Bintanath was a political necessity, the subsequent marriage to Meritamen reveals something even more disturbing about Ramesses II's character. By the time he married his second daughter, likely in the early 1250s BC, the pharaoh had already solved his immediate succession problems. Bintanath was serving capably as great royal wife, and several of his sons were of age to serve as crown princes. Yet Ramesses chose to repeat the abomination. Meritamen, daughter of the beloved Nefertari, had grown up as one of the most favored children in the royal household. Ancient inscriptions describe her as exceptionally beautiful, and artistic depictions show a young woman with the refined elegance that marked the highest ranks of Egyptian nobility. Unlike Bintanath, who was the daughter of his Zetnofret and therefore somewhat removed from the center of royal affection, Meritamen was the child of Ramesses' greatest love. This makes her father's decision to marry her all the more cruel, where political necessity might explain, though never excuse, the marriage to Bintanath. The marriage to Meritamen seems driven by something darker, perhaps an obsession with control, a desire to possess completely those he claimed to love, or simply the megalomaniacal conviction that all of Egypt, including his own children, existed solely for his pleasure. The psychological impact on Meritamen would have been devastating. Having lost her beloved mother, Nefertari, she now found herself forced into the most intimate possible relationship with her father. The man who should have protected her, who should have been her refuge in a hostile world, had instead become her jailer and abuser. Yet, like her half-sister, Meritamen adapted to her circumstances with remarkable resilience. She took on the duties of queenship, participated in diplomatic missions, and served as a patron of the arts. Archaeological evidence suggests she may have been particularly devoted to the goddess Hathor, perhaps finding in religious devotion some comfort that was denied to her in earthly relationships. The famous White Queen statue, long believed to represent Ramesses' mother Tuya, is now thought by many scholars to depict Meritamen. If this identification is correct, the statue reveals a woman of serene beauty and apparent dignity, giving no hint of the trauma that must have defined her daily existence. Among the most tragic aspects of Ramesses II's marriages to his daughters are the children born of these unions. While the historical record is incomplete, we know that at least Bintanath bore her father a child, and it's likely that Meritamen did as well. These children faced a unique form of suffering. Born of incest, they carried within their very DNA the consequences of their grandfather's obsession with bloodline purity. The children of incestuous unions face significantly higher risks of genetic disorders, birth defects, and early death. In ancient Egypt, lacking any understanding of genetics, such problems would have been attributed to divine displeasure or demonic influence. The children themselves would have grown up knowing that they were somehow different, somehow cursed, without understanding why. Consider the psychological burden carried by a child who discovers that their mother is also their sister, that their father is also their grandfather. In a society that placed enormous emphasis on ancestry and lineage, these children would have struggled to understand their place in the world. Were they princes and princesses? Or were they abominations? Were they blessed by the gods or cursed by them? The fate of most of these children remains unknown to us. Some may have died in infancy, victims of the genetic disorders that plague the offspring of closely related parents. Others may have survived to adulthood but been kept away from public view, hidden embarrassments to the royal family. A few may have been raised as normal members of the royal household, their true parentage disguised or forgotten. To fully grasp the institutional nature of the horror inflicted upon Ramesses II's daughters, we must understand how royal marriages were conducted in ancient Egypt. These were not private affairs, but elaborate state ceremonies involving hundreds of participants and lasting for days or even weeks. The process would have begun months in advance, with priests consulting sacred texts and astronomical charts to determine the most auspicious date for the ceremony. Palace officials would have coordinated with the royal workshops to create the regalia, jewelry, and ceremonial objects required for the occasion. Foreign dignitaries would have been invited and preparations made to house and feed the hundreds of guests who would attend. On the day of the ceremony, the bride would have been prepared by her attendants in rituals that had remained unchanged for centuries. Her body would have been purified with sacred oils and waters. She would have been dressed in the finest linens, adorned with gold and precious stones, and crowned with the vulture headdress that symbolized her new status as queen. The ceremony itself would have taken place in the presence of the court, with the couple standing before altars dedicated to the gods who sanctified royal marriage. Sacred texts would have been read, offerings made, and vows exchanged. The Pharaoh would have placed the ring of queenship upon his daughter's finger, formally investing her with the powers and responsibilities of her new position. Following the ceremony, there would have been days of celebration, feasts, entertainments, religious observances, and the presentation of gifts from nobles and foreign rulers. Throughout it all, the new queen would have been expected to smile, to appear joyful, to play her part in the theater of royal power. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of these ceremonies was their normalcy. To the participants and observers, this was not an aberration, but a sacred duty. Not a crime, but a divine blessing. The very elaborateness of the rituals served to legitimize what should have been unthinkable. While Ramesses II's marriages to his daughters were particularly well documented and egregious, they were part of a broader pattern of incestuous marriage that characterized Egyptian royal families for over 1,000 years. Understanding this pattern helps us see these individual cases not as isolated instances of personal depravity, but as symptoms of a systematic dehumanization of royal women. The practice appears to have begun during the Old Kingdom period, around 2600 BC, when pharaohs first began marrying their sisters to preserve bloodline purity. Initially, these marriages may have been purely ceremonial, designed to reinforce the divine nature of kingship without involving actual conjugal relations. However, by the Middle Kingdom period, circa 2000 BC, brother-sister marriages were producing children, indicating that they had become genuine unions. During the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BC, the period that included Ramesses II's reign, royal incest reached its peak. Pharaohs routinely married their sisters, half-sisters, and eventually their daughters. The practice was so normalized that royal women who married outside the immediate family were considered to have made inferior matches. The Ptolemaic period, 305-30 BC, which began after Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt, saw these practices reach their logical conclusion. The Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that adopted Egyptian customs, practiced such extensive inbreeding that by the time of Cleopatra VII, the family tree had collapsed into an almost incomprehensible tangle of repeated names and relationships. Each generation of royal incest produced new victims, women forced into relationships that violated every natural instinct, children born with genetic defects, and entire bloodlines that grew progressively weaker and more unstable. Yet the practice continued because it served the political needs of the ruling class, regardless of the human cost. Modern psychology provides us with tools to understand the psychological impact of incestuous relationships that were unavailable to ancient peoples. We now know that incest, particularly when it involves such extreme power imbalances as those between a pharaoh and his daughters, creates a specific pattern of trauma that can affect victims for their entire lives. The psychological effects of father-daughter incest include profound feelings of betrayal, powerlessness, and confusion about identity and relationships. Victims often struggle with depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming healthy intimate relationships. They may experience dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism that allows the mind to separate from traumatic experiences, and may develop complex coping strategies to survive in situations where escape is impossible. For Bintanath and Meritamen, these psychological challenges would have been compounded by their unique positions as both victims and queens. They would have been expected to maintain the dignity and authority of their royal status, while enduring private trauma that no one around them would have recognized as abuse. The very people who should have protected them, their father, the priests, the court officials, were instead the architects and enablers of their suffering. Yet both women appear to have found ways to cope with their circumstances. They took on the responsibilities of queenship with apparent competence, participated in diplomatic activities, and maintained the public persona required of their positions. This resilience is remarkable, but it should not be romanticized. Survival in the face of trauma is not the same as thriving, and we can only imagine the private anguish these women endured. The fact that they could function in their public roles while enduring such private horror speaks to the extraordinary strength of the human spirit. But it also reveals the terrible adaptability that trauma can impose upon its victims. When escape is impossible, the mind finds ways to survive even in the most degrading circumstances. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ramesses II's marriages to his daughters was how thoroughly the Egyptian state machinery worked to legitimize and celebrate these unions. This was not a matter of individual corruption, but of institutional complicity on a massive scale. The priests, who should have been the guardians of moral law, instead crafted theological justifications for incestuous marriage. They pointed to the gods Osiris and Isis, siblings who had married and ruled the underworld together, as divine precedent for royal incest. They developed elaborate rituals that transformed abusive relationships into sacred ceremonies. They created myths and stories that portrayed such marriages as blessed by the gods and essential for cosmic order. The court officials, who managed the daily operations of government, integrated these marriages seamlessly into the normal functions of royal administration. They organized the ceremonies, managed the logistics, and ensured that the new queens were properly honored and their children recognized as legitimate heirs. They created artistic and literary works that celebrated these unions and portrayed them as examples of divine love. The artists and craftsmen who decorated temples and monuments created beautiful depictions of the pharaoh with his daughter wives, showing them in poses of affection and respect that concealed the horror of their actual relationships. These artistic works, many of which survive today, present a sanitized version of history that obscures the human cost of royal power. Even the common people of Egypt appear to have accepted these marriages without significant protest. This may have been due to fear of royal power, genuine religious belief in the divine nature of the pharaoh, or simply the understanding that ordinary mortals had no right to question the actions of gods. This institutional complicity reveals something deeply disturbing about how societies can normalize even the most heinous practices when they serve the interests of those in power. It shows us how systems of authority can corrupt not just individuals but entire civilizations, creating environments where the unthinkable becomes routine and the abhorrent becomes sacred. While Egyptian society had normalized royal incest over centuries of practice, the international community of the ancient world viewed these marriages with attitudes ranging from bewilderment to horror. This external perspective provides us with a valuable counterpoint to the Egyptian narrative and reminds us that even in ancient times, many cultures recognized incestuous marriage as fundamentally wrong. The Hittites, Egypt's great rivals to the north, practiced royal polygamy but drew the line at close incest. When they negotiated marriage alliances with Egypt, Hittite princesses were sent to marry pharaohs but never their own relatives. Hittite diplomatic records, preserved in cuneiform tablets, occasionally reference Egyptian royal practices with what appears to be barely concealed disgust. The Mesopotamian kingdoms, with their own complex royal traditions, maintained strict taboos against father-daughter marriage. Mesopotamian law codes, some dating back over 1,000 years before Ramesses II, explicitly prohibited incestuous relationships and prescribed severe punishments for those who violated these taboos. Even within Egypt's sphere of influence, some vassal states appear to have been disturbed by their overlords' marital practices. Diplomatic correspondence from the ancient city-states of the Levant occasionally contains subtle criticisms of Egyptian royal customs, though always carefully phrased to avoid giving offense to their powerful neighbor. This international disapproval had practical consequences for Egypt's foreign policy. Some potential allies were reluctant to send their daughters in marriage to a pharaoh who might later marry his own children. Some diplomatic marriages were delayed or cancelled due to concerns about Egyptian royal practices. Egypt's reputation for wisdom and justice, built up over centuries of successful rule, was gradually undermined by its royal family's sexual behavior. Yet, despite this international pressure, Egyptian pharaohs continued to marry their daughters. The internal logic of divine kingship was apparently stronger than external diplomatic concerns, revealing the degree to which the Egyptian elite had become isolated from normal human moral reasoning. Ramesses II died in 1213 BC after ruling Egypt for 66 years. His death marked the end of one of the longest and most successful reigns in Egyptian history, but it also revealed the ultimate failure of his incestuous marriage strategy. Despite his desperate attempts to preserve bloodline purity through marriage to his daughters, the succession that followed his death was chaotic and disputed. His son Merneptah, now an elderly man himself, inherited the throne but ruled for only 10 years before his own death. The pharaohs who followed were increasingly weak and short-lived, suggesting that the genetic damage caused by generations of inbreeding was finally taking its toll on the royal bloodline. Bintanat survived her father's death and continued to hold a position of honor at court during her brother's reign. She was eventually buried in a magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Queens, the necropolis reserved for royal women. Her tomb paintings show her in the company of the gods, apparently at peace in death after a life of unimaginable suffering. Meritamin's fate after her father's death is less clear. She may have died during Ramesses' reign, or she may have chosen to withdraw from public life after his death. Her tomb, also in the Valley of the Queens, contains some of the most beautiful artwork from the New Kingdom period, suggesting that even in death, she was honored for her royal status. The children born of these incestuous unions largely disappear from the historical record. Some may have died young from genetic disorders. Others may have been passed over in the succession due to their problematic parentage. A few may have survived to play minor roles in the royal court, but none achieved the prominence of their grandfather. The dynasty that Ramesses had tried so desperately to secure through incestuous marriage lasted only a few more generations before collapsing entirely. Egypt entered a period of decline and division that would last for centuries, proving that no amount of bloodline purity could substitute for good governance and moral legitimacy. While the specific practice of royal father-daughter marriage has largely disappeared from the modern world, the underlying mechanisms that enabled these horrors remain depressingly familiar. Systems of absolute power continue to create environments where the vulnerable are exploited and abused, often with the complicity of institutions that should protect them. The way Egyptian society normalized and celebrated incestuous royal marriages mirrors how other societies have rationalized their own systems of oppression. The theological justifications created by Egyptian priests echo the ideological frameworks used to justify slavery, genocide, and other crimes against humanity throughout history. The institutional complicity that enabled royal incest resembles the organizational silence that allows modern abuse to continue unchecked. Perhaps most disturbing is the way artistic and cultural production was used to obscure the reality of these relationships. The beautiful temple reliefs showing Ramesses with his daughter wives, the poetry celebrating their unions, the official inscriptions describing their happiness. All of this served to create a false narrative that concealed the truth about royal abuse. This sanitization of history through art and literature continues today in how societies remember and commemorate their own dark chapters. The story of Ramesses II and his daughters also reminds us of the importance of questioning authority, even when that authority claims divine sanction. The Egyptian belief that pharaohs were gods made it impossible for anyone to challenge their actions, no matter how harmful those actions might be. This absolute deference to power created an environment where atrocities could flourish unchallenged. Throughout this dark narrative, one theme emerges with startling clarity: the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Bintanath and Meritamen, trapped in a system that viewed them as objects rather than human beings, nevertheless found ways to survive and even to contribute meaningfully to their society. Both women appear to have developed coping strategies that allowed them to function in their public roles while enduring private trauma. They participated in diplomatic missions, patronized religious institutions, and served as cultural leaders in ways that suggest they found purpose and meaning despite their circumstances. This resilience should not be romanticized. It was born of necessity rather than choice, but it deserves to be recognized and honored. Their ability to maintain dignity and authority while subjected to systematic abuse reveals something profound about human nature. Even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people can find ways to assert their humanity and make positive contributions to the world around them. This does not excuse the systems that oppress them, but it reminds us of the fundamental strength that exists within every human being. The fact that both women were eventually buried with the full honors due to queens, that the tombs contain some of the most beautiful art of their era, that they are remembered today not primarily as victims, but as important historical figures, suggests that they succeeded in transcending the circumstances of their abuse. They became more than what the system tried to make them, and in doing so, they achieved a form of victory over their oppressors. As we reach the end of this disturbing journey through one of history's darkest chapters, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that the story of Ramesses II and his daughters is not unique. Throughout human history, systems of power have created victims whose suffering has been obscured by the grand narratives of political achievement and cultural accomplishment. The magnificent temples of Abu Simbel, the beautiful art of the New Kingdom, the diplomatic achievements of Ramesses' reign, all of these accomplishments were built upon a foundation of human suffering that historians have too often chosen to ignore or minimize. The price of pharaonic glory was paid not just by the slaves who built the monuments or the soldiers who died in battle, but by the royal women who were treated as breeding stock for the continuation of divine rule. Yet, in remembering these forgotten victims, we also discover something inspiring about the capacity for survival and dignity in the face of absolute powerlessness. Bintanath and Meritamen were not just passive victims of their father's ambition. They were complex human beings who found ways to live meaningful lives despite impossible circumstances. They deserve to be remembered not just for what was done to them, but for how they responded to their suffering. Their story resonates across the millennia because it touches on fundamental questions that remain relevant today. How do systems of power corrupt those who wield them? How do societies normalize the unthinkable? How do victims of systematic abuse find ways to survive and maintain their humanity? How do we balance appreciation for historical achievements with honest acknowledgement of their human cost? The fundamental question raised by the marriages of Ramesses II to his daughters, whether political necessity can ever justify the sacrifice of human dignity, remains as relevant today as it was 33 centuries ago. In our own time, we continue to witness the ways that power corrupts, that institutions fail their most vulnerable members, that societies rationalize the suffering of those who cannot defend themselves. But we also continue to see the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for survival and dignity that exists even in the darkest circumstances. In the story of two young women who were forced to become their father's wives, who endured unimaginable trauma while maintaining their public duties, who found ways to transcend their victimization and leave their mark on history, we find both a warning about the dangers of absolute power and an inspiration about the strength of the human soul. Picture once more that throne room in P. Ramesses where a father and daughter stood as husband and wife. But this time, look beyond the golden regalia and sacred ceremonies to see the human beings at the center of this tragedy. See Bintanat, forced into an abhorrent marriage but determined to fulfill her duties with dignity. See Meritamen, traumatized by her father's betrayal but still finding ways to serve her people. See them not just as victims of ancient barbarism, but as examples of the resilience and strength that define the best of humanity, even in its darkest hours. They lived, they endured, they survived, and in their survival, they remind us that no system of oppression, no matter how complete or how justified by religion and tradition, can ultimately destroy the fundamental dignity of the human spirit. Their legacy is not just one of suffering, but of the triumph of human dignity over impossible odds. This is why we remember them. This is why the story matters. This is why, across 33 centuries of time and continents of space, we are still moved by the courage of two young women who faced the unthinkable and found ways to remain human in the midst of inhumanity. May their memory be a blessing. May their story be a warning. And may their resilience inspire us to never accept the unacceptable, no matter how beautifully it may be disguised or how divinely it may be justified.